Breakdown on binding and non-binding regulatory conditions. Welcome everyone. Today we will discuss one of the most important concepts introduced through ICH-Q12 guideline, the distinction between the regulatory binding and non-binding information within CTD Module 3. Many CMC regulatory professionals focuses heavily on the preparing the initial NDA or BLA. However, experienced regulatory professionals know that the true value of understanding Module 3 comes after approval. When manufacturing changes, analytical improvement, site transfers, specification revisions, and the process optimization must be managed efficiently. Understanding which elements are legally binding and which are supportive information directly impacts the post-approval change management strategy, reporting categories, regulatory burden, and life cycle flexibility. Learning roadmap, understanding established conditions, ECs. We also understand what ICH-Q12 framework. ICH-Q12 introduced the concept of the established condition, also called ECs. The objective was to create a globally harmonized framework allowing the companies and the regulators to clearly identify which information is critical to assuring the product quality. Not every piece of information submitted in Module 3 carries the same regulatory significance. Some information become legally binding once approved by the health authorities, while other information serves as a scientific justification and supporting evidence. As a regulatory professional, our role is to understand this distinction because it determines how future changes will be managed through the product lifecycle. What are regulatory binding established conditions? Established conditions are elements of marketing application considered necessary to assure product quality. These includes information that directly defines the approved state of the product and the process. Example include manufacturing process description, critical process control, specification, acceptance criteria, analytical procedure, manufacturing sites. Health authority assess and approve these conditions during application review. Once approved, any modification may require regulatory reporting depending on the associated reporting category. Think of EC as a regulatory contract between the company and the health authority regarding the product quality. Regulatory binding versus supportive information. A useful way to understand the distinction is to think in terms of the regulatory action. Established conditions require regulatory oversight when changed because they might impact the product quality, safety, or efficacy. Supportive information provides the scientific rational development history, validation evidence, supportive data, but that does not itself define the approval state. For example, a manufacturing process description may be an EC. The development studies explaining why the process was chosen are usually supportive information. This distinction is central to the risk-based lifecycle management. Role of regulators in establishing ECs. Regulators performed a detailed assessment to determine which information qualifies as an established condition. Their review focuses on whether a specific element is necessary to consistently ensure the product quality. Following approval, authorities may assign the reporting categories such as prior approval supplement, moderate change, annual report notification, and the regulator's objective is to balance the patient protection with the operational flexibility. A well-defined established condition framework allows innovation while maintaining the regulatory control where needed. Implications of regulatory approval of ECs. Once an established condition is approved, it becomes legally binding condition. Any change requires the evaluation against the applicable reporting requirements. This creates a structural framework for the lifecycle management. Benefits includes the consistent quality assurance, regulatory transparency, predictable change management, enhanced regulatory trust. Over time, regulators may reassess the EC concepts as scientific understanding evolves, particularly with advanced manufacturing technologies and the digital system. Importance of ECs in marketing authorization. Established conditions provide multiple benefits. First, they improve the regulatory flexibility by clearly defining what requires approval and what can be managed internally. Second, they enhance the communication between regulators and the industry. Third, they support the life cycle management by allowing the companies to focus regulatory resources on changes that truly matters. Finally, they enable the knowledge-based pharmaceutical development, aligning closely with the quality by design principle. Things to remember. Understanding non-binding regulatory condition. Not all information submitted in Module 3 is legally enforceable. Non-binding conditions, supportive information help the regulator understand the scientific rationale behind the product development. Example includes the development report, validation summaries, characterization summaries, comparability report. An important concept is that GMP requirements are not established conditions. GMP compliance remains the mandatory, but the GMP procedure themselves are managed operationally rather than the EC framework. Understanding this distinction prevents unnecessary regulatory submission. Overview of CMC module in CTD and established condition. Module 3 contains the detailed quality information supporting approval. Key sections includes 32S drug substance, 32P drug product, 32A appendices. Module 2.3 provides the quality overall summary and present a higher level interpretation of the quality information. In Japan, additional binding quality information may also be captured within the application form in Module 1. Therefore, EC assessment should consider the entire dossier, not only the Module 3. While detailed information resides within the Module 3, the regulatory commitments may also appear in Module 2 summaries, application form, and the regional administrative documents. CMC professionals should understand the binding commitments may originate from multiple sections of the submission package. Drug substance, general information. For drug substance, nomenclature and the structure are generally considered binding because they define the identity of the active substance. General properties are typically non-binding because they provide the descriptive scientific information rather than approved condition. Manufacturer information is binding because the approved manufacturing site directly impacts the quality assurance and the regulatory oversight. Drug substance manufacturing. The manufacturing process and the associated control represent core established condition. Binding elements includes the manufacturing process description, control of material, control of critical steps, intermediate controls. In contrast, the process validation report, the process development history are generally supportive information. These documents justify the process but do not themselves define the approved state. Drug substance characterization and control. Characterization studies provide scientific understanding but generally are not established condition. For example, structural elucidation, characterization report, impurity investigation. However, specifications and the analytical procedures are binding because they establish release and the control requirement. The key principle is that the scientific understanding supports quality while the specification enforces quality. Drug substance specification and standards. Analytical validation reports are generally supportive information. The approved analytical method and itself is the established condition. Similarly, batch analysis, specification, justification are supporting evidence. Reference standard and container closure system are binding because they directly impact the quality control and the product integrity. Drug substance stability. Approved shelf life and stability conclusions are generally binding. However, stability protocol, stability commitment, stability study reports are usually supportive information. The distinction is important because updating stability data often does not require the same level of regulatory oversight as changing an approved expiry period. 32P Drug Product Description and Development. Drug product composition is binding because it defines the approved formulation. Pharmaceutical development studies, however, are generally non-binding. These studies explain why the formulation was selected but do not themselves establish the approved condition. This distinction provides the flexibility for the continued formulation knowledge generation. Drug product manufacture. For drug product manufacturing, binding information includes manufacturing sites, batch formula, manufacturing process description, process control. These elements define the approved commercial manufacturing process. Any modification may trigger the post-approval reporting requirements. Drug product controls. Critical process control remain binding because they ensures the process consistency. Validation studies are generally supportive. Excipients, specification, analytical methods are binding. Validation documents supporting those methods remain non-binding. The same logic applies to the drug substance control. Specification and analytical procedures are binding condition. Justification of specification is not binding. Excipient of human and animal origin, novel excipients are binding. Specification and analytical methods are binding. Validation documentation supporting those methods remain non-binding. This follows the same logic applied to the drug substance control. Drug product analytical control. Analytical validation reports and batch analysis provide supportive evidence. Characterization of impurities and justification of specifications are also supportive functions. Regulatory focus remains on the approved specification and analytical method themselves. This distinction provides the flexibility for scientific update while maintaining the regulatory changeover quality standards. Reference standards or materials, container closure systems are binding conditions. Drug product stability. Approved stability conclusion is generally binding. Supportive stability protocol and the study reports remain non-binding. This allows company to continue collecting the life cycle stability data without necessarily triggering the regulatory action unless approved conditions are changed. Appendices and the regional information. Appendices contain specialized information supporting product quality. Facilities and equipment may be considered binding because they relate directly to the approved manufacturing capability. However, advantageous agent evaluation, executed batch record, method validation package, comparability protocol are generally supportive information. These documents provide evidence and justification but do not themselves become the established regulatory commitment. The key takeaway from this entire presentation is that the understanding the distinction between the established and the supportive information is fundamental to successful implementation of the ICH Q12 and the efficient post-approval lifecycle management. As regulatory professional, our objective is to build the submission that clearly identify what is truly binding while preserving maximum flexibility for future improvement. Remember, EC define the approved state. Supportive information explain why that state is acceptable. Thank you. See you in the next session.